You have probably felt it at some point. The quiet suspicion that you are doing everything you were told to do, and it is not working the way it was supposed to. The confidence, the ambition, the presence, the results on paper that should translate into a certain kind of standing. And yet the men who seem to carry something that makes people genuinely respect them, that makes women genuinely drawn to them, those men appear to not be doing any of this. They are not performing. They are not trying. They simply are. Something that you cannot quite name and cannot quite manufacture, no matter how precisely you imitate the surface. What you are sensing is not a personality trait. It is not charisma or looks or some genetic advantage. What you are sensing is that these men have, whether consciously or not, found the dominant strategy in a game that most men do not even know they are playing. Game theory is the branch of mathematics concerned with exactly this question. What is the optimal strategy in a game where your outcome depends on what other people do?
And it turns out that the answer, applied to the question of genuine respect, is almost perfectly counterintuitive. The behaviors that generate it are not the behaviors that look like generating it.
Game theory was not developed to explain human attraction or male social status. It was developed by mathematicians and economists in the mid-20th century, most famously by John von Neumann and John Nash, to model conflict and cooperation between rational agents. How should nations negotiate? How should companies compete? How should individuals behave when their choices interact with the choices of others? What game theory found across decades of research was that the mathematically optimal strategies in repeated social games share a profile that is surprisingly consistent and surprisingly at odds with how most men actually behave. This video is about what that profile looks like, why most men never find it, and what 3,000 years of philosophy had already worked out long before the equations were written down. There is a warning I want to offer up front. Some of what you are about to hear will feel familiar in a way that is comfortable, confirmation of things you already believed. Resist that comfort. The interesting part of this subject is not where game theory confirms conventional wisdom, it is where it contradicts it. And it contradicts it in several places that matter quite a lot, particularly for men who have been working hard at this for years and wondering why the results do not match the effort.
Think about what male status competition actually looks like in its most visible form. The man who speaks longest at the meeting. The man who wins the argument, even when winning costs him the relationship. The man who lifts the most and makes sure the right people know it. The man who never admits uncertainty, never backs down, never concedes a point that could be conceded without consequence. These behaviors have a logic. They are optimized for a specific game, a game where hierarchy is determined by immediate, visible dominance signals. Who is louder? Who is physically larger? Who is most willing to escalate? It is a game with rules that every boy learns very early in schoolyards and locker rooms and online forums before he has the conceptual framework to question whether the game is worth winning. Here is what game theory asks that most frameworks do not. What is the payoff matrix of this game? What are you actually optimizing for? And what does winning actually get you? Because here is the uncomfortable answer. The adolescent dominance game, the one most men are still playing well into their 30s without realizing it,
has a payoff matrix optimized for local short-term hierarchy. It is designed to win room-level contests, argument by argument, interaction by interaction. And the adult game, the one that produces actual standing, genuine attraction, professional respect, lasting influence, has an almost entirely different payoff matrix. Reliability, emotional regulation, network value, credibility of commitments, depth over display. These are not the rewards of the same competition. They are not even measured on the same axis.
The reason this matters is not merely philosophical. Game theory is precise about this. A strategy that is optimal in one game can be actively counterproductive in another. If you have spent years developing the reflexes of the adolescent game, the quick escalation, the defensive posturing, the visible status signaling, those reflexes do not just fail to help you in the adult game. They actively mark you as someone who has not made the transition. And the people whose respect you are seeking, both the women you want to attract and the men you want to be regarded by, are, consciously or not, running a very fast background process that is categorizing you based on which game your behavior reveals you are playing. You are not being evaluated on any single impressive moment. You are being read. And the reading is very accurate and very fast and almost impossible to fool for long.
John Nash's most important contribution to game theory was the concept that bears his name, the Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is a state in a game where no player can improve their outcome by unilaterally changing their strategy, given what every other player is doing. It is a point of stability. Not necessarily a good outcome for anyone, but a stable one, because no individual has an incentive to deviate from it. What Nash showed was that virtually all social games eventually settle into equilibria of this kind. Not because anyone decided they would, not because any authority enforced them, but because the individual incentives playing out across thousands of interactions produce states where everyone is already doing the best they can, given what everyone else is doing. Now apply this to male social status. In any group, a workplace, a social circle, a community, there is an equilibrium around who is treated as high status. People defer to certain men not because they each independently evaluated those men and decided to defer. They defer because given that everyone else does, it is individually rational to do the same. The equilibrium is self-sustaining. And here is the insight that most men never fully absorb.
You cannot force your way into the position of being recognized as already inhabiting a certain level. When you try, when you assert status, demand respect, position yourself visibly, you are signaling to every observer that you are outside the equilibrium and attempting to enter it. And that signal triggers a social immune response. The very attempt disqualifies you from the outcome. The equilibrium is only accessible to those who are already perceived as operating within it. Marcus Aurelius understood this intuitively, though he would not have used this language. He was the most powerful man in the Western world for nearly 2 decades, emperor of Rome at its height, commanding millions of soldiers, governing hundreds of subjects, and his private journal, the Meditations, which he never intended anyone to read, is full of reminders to himself to be patient, to not react, to serve without needing recognition for serving, to hold his position not by asserting it, but by being it, continuously, in private as in public, with no audience required. He was playing the ultimate repeated game with the longest possible time horizon, and his private notes reveal a man who understood, viscerally, that the only way to remain at the center of the equilibrium was to never need to be seen at its center. Imagine what it would feel like to be so secure in your position that you had no impulse to defend it, to receive criticism without needing to correct the record, to be in a room where your status is contested and feel genuinely nothing. Not because you have suppressed the reaction, but because the contest does not register as threatening. That is not a personality type. That is what the equilibrium feels like from the inside.
and it is what everyone around you can sense in you, or cannot. There is no middle position. In 1975, an Israeli biologist named Amot Zahavi proposed what he called the Handicap Principle. It began as an answer to a puzzle in evolutionary biology. Why do male peacocks have tails? The tail is metabolically expensive to grow and maintain. It makes the bird dramatically more vulnerable to predators. On any simple cost-benefit analysis, it should not exist. It should have been selected out of the population long ago. Zahavi's insight was that this framing had the logic backwards. The tail exists because it is a burden. Precisely because it is costly, difficult, and dangerous to maintain, it reliably signals something that cannot be faked, the genetic quality required to survive in spite of carrying it. A cheap signal, one that anyone can produce regardless of quality, carries no information. The costly signal, the signal that only the genuinely capable can maintain, is the one that actually communicates something true. Apply this to male status signaling in its modern form. What are the cheap signals?
Brand clothing, Instagram aesthetics, expensive cars on credit, verbal dominance, social media metrics, gym selfies. What do these have in common? They are producible by anyone, regardless of their actual resource base or character. A man with nothing can appear to have everything, for a time, through cheap signaling. And because the signals are cheap, because anyone can produce them, they carry almost no information about the underlying quality of the person producing them. Sophisticated social observers, whether consciously or not, discount cheap signals heavily. They have learned to, through long experience of signals that turned out to be empty. What are the costly signals? Keeping your word when breaking it would be easy and convenient. Staying genuinely calm under provocation when everyone expects you to react. Admitting uncertainty in a context where admitting uncertainty costs you. Choosing a long-term position over a short-term advantage in a visible situation. These are costly precisely because they are difficult to maintain without the internal surplus, the emotional regulation, the security, the patience to sustain them. They cannot be faked for long. And because they cannot be faked, they communicate something real. Restraint is a costly signal. It signals that you have enough internal resources that you can afford to withhold the display. The man who does not escalate when provoked is not signaling weakness. He is signaling surplus. He has more than enough. And everyone in the room can feel the difference between the two, even if no one can name it precisely. In the late 1970s, a political scientist at the University of Michigan named Robert Axelrod became curious about a specific question. In a world of self-interested actors, how does cooperation emerge? To answer it, he ran an experiment. He invited game theorists, economists, mathematicians, and social scientists to submit computer strategies for playing the iterated prisoner's dilemma, a game where two players, across many rounds, each choose to cooperate or defect, with payoff structured so that defection always looks attractive in the short term, but mutual defection produces the worst overall outcome across time. The strategies submitted ranged from simple to extraordinarily complex, from aggressive to elaborately conditional. Axelrod ran them all against each other and tallied the results across hundreds of rounds. He then published the results and ran a second tournament. The winner was the same both times. The winning strategy was the simplest submitted. It was contributed by a psychologist named Anatol Rappaport, and it consisted of 4 lines of code. Cooperate on the first move, then exactly mirror whatever the other player did on the previous move. That was it. Tit for tat. It won not by being clever, not by being unpredictable,
not by exploiting weaknesses, but by embodying 4 properties that turned out to be dominant across all conditions. Nice. It never defects first. Retaliatory. It responds to defection immediately and without hesitation. Forgiving. After punishing defection, it returns to cooperation without carrying the grudge forward. Clear. Its behavior is simple enough that other players can quickly read the pattern and calibrate accordingly. Axelrod observed that strategies with these 4 properties consistently outperformed more sophisticated, more aggressive, and more manipulative approaches in every environment against every mix of opponents. Think about what these 4 properties look like in a human context. Nice. The man who does not start conflicts, who is genuinely generous first,
who extends good faith without naivety. Retaliatory. The man whose word means something because breaking it has always had real consequences. Not dramatic, not escalating, but real and consistent. Forgiving. The man who does not carry resentment, who can repair a relationship after conflict without requiring lengthy reconciliation rituals, who moves forward cleanly. Clear? The man whose behavior is legible and consistent, who is the same person in every context, whose responses are predictable not because he is simple, but because he is coherent. These are not personality quirks. These are the mathematically dominant properties in repeated social games. The people around you are tracking your pattern across the repeated game, whether you know it or not. Miyamoto Musashi understood the power of accumulated patterning. Japan's most celebrated swordsman, undefeated across more than 60 duels. Musashi documented in his later years that he would sometimes arrive deliberately late to a scheduled duel, forcing his opponent to wait in mounting tension and uncertainty. This was not rude. This was not rudeness. It was strategy. His reputation was so deeply established, so credibly costly, built across decades of real tests, that it could function as a weapon before he drew steel. The waiting was itself a signal. I have been here before. I know exactly what this is. You do not destabilize me. The equilibrium around Musashi was so well established that the mere prospect of the encounter had already shifted the psychological dynamic entirely in his favor.
What is remarkable, looking at the game theoretic analysis of male social status, is how consistently the major philosophical traditions arrived at the same conclusions, without the mathematics, without the tournaments, simply through careful observation of how human beings actually work across time. Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher writing in the 1st and 2nd century, was born a slave. He could not have chosen a starting position with less social power. And from that starting position, he developed a framework for human conduct that maps almost precisely onto what game theory would later formalize. He called it prohairesis, the faculty of choice. Specifically, the capacity to choose one's own judgments, responses, and actions, regardless of external conditions. His core insight: the only domain over which you have actual sovereignty is your own internal response to events. Everything else, reputation, others' opinions, the outcomes of your actions in the world, is outside your control and should be released from your optimization function entirely. In game theory terms, this is the identification of your dominant strategy, the strategy that produces the best available outcome regardless of what the other player does. A dominant strategy does not depend on what the opponent chooses. It is optimal across all scenarios. Prohairesis is the psychological implementation of dominant strategy thinking. Focus entirely on what is within your control, which is your own conduct, your own judgments, your own responses. Release attachment to outcomes you cannot control. And because your conduct is what actually determines the long-run pattern that others read, not the outcomes, which are noisy and unreliable,
This focus on internal conduct over external results is not just philosophically elegant, it is strategically correct. Marcus Aurelius echoed this directly. Things have no hold on the soul. They have no access to it, cannot move or direct it. It is moved and directed by itself alone. The Tao Te Ching describes a different angle on the same truth.
Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, is the principle that the highest form of effectiveness works with natural patterns rather than against them. The way never acts, yet nothing is left undone. The paradox that Laozi describes is precisely the paradox of the Nash equilibrium. The man who tries to force his way into the position of being respected is working against the natural dynamics of how status actually accretes. The man who simply embodies the attractor state,
Who is genuinely what the equilibrium rewards, continuously without performance, finds that respect accretes to him through a process that feels, from the outside, almost effortless. This is not passivity. It is the highest form of strategic alignment, working with the game rather than against it. Nietzsche framed the same distinction as two entirely different games. Resentment, the reactive psychology of someone who can only feel elevated by diminishing others, who defines himself entirely through opposition, who is energized by enemies and victories over rivals, is what game theorists would call a zero-sum orientation. Every point I gain is a point you lose. The pie is fixed. Will to power? Not power over others, but the generative drive to become more fully what you are, to create, to build, to contribute something that did not exist before, is non-zero sum. Value is being generated, not redistributed. The deeply respected men in any community are almost always playing non-zero sum games.
The men who are most visibly jockeying for status, signaling hardest, competing most aggressively, they are almost always playing zero-sum. And zero-sum competition is the Nash equilibrium of scarcity. It is the game of men who do not yet have enough to afford another orientation. And then there is Machiavelli, almost always misread. Chapter 17 of The Prince poses the question that has made him infamous. Is it better to be loved or feared? His answer is that it is best to be both. But when you must choose, it is safer to be feared than loved. What is almost never quoted is why. His argument is not about cruelty. It is about credibility. Love, Machiavelli writes, depends on the other person's will, which is conditional, self-interested, and unreliable when tested. Fear depends on your own actions, which you control. The ruler who is feared has credible enforcement capacity. His commitments are credible because defecting on them has real consequences. The ruler who is only loved has made only cheap promises. The modern reading is this: the men who are most deeply respected are those whose word functions as a commitment device, because they have a demonstrated history of following through at personal cost. That history cannot be faked. It is built in the repeated game, one interaction at a time, over years.
Here is the synthesis that game theory, evolutionary biology, and 3,000 years of philosophy all point toward, from different directions and in different languages. There is a behavioral profile, a pattern of conduct that functions as what physicists would call an attractor state. In dynamical systems, an attractor is a condition that a system naturally moves toward over time, regardless of where it starts. Small perturbations do not push it out of the attractor permanently. It returns. The behavioral profile we have been tracing throughout this video functions this way in social systems. Once a man genuinely inhabits it, not performs it, but inhabits it. The social dynamics around him naturally organize around it. People defer, women respond differently, peers extend trust without being asked. The equilibrium accretes, not because he's trying to produce these effects, but because the pattern itself is what the game rewards. What is that profile? It is not a list of techniques. But if you pressed game theory, evolutionary biology, and the philosophical traditions into a single synthesis, it would look something like this. It plays the repeated game. It optimizes for pattern across time, not for the single interaction. It sends costly signals. It demonstrates quality through things that cannot be faked. Reliability under cost, restraint under provocation,
Consistency without audience. It operates within the Nash equilibrium. It does not try to enter the equilibrium. It simply is the equilibrium. And the equilibrium remains stable because every player around it has no incentive to challenge it. It runs tit for tat. It is genuinely generous first, immediately and proportionally responsive to how it is treated, forgiving without resentment, and legible enough to be read correctly. And it plays non-zero sum. It generates value,
Creates opportunities, contributes to the network rather than extracting from it. Picture what this actually looks like as a life, not as a technique applied situationally, but as a genuine orientation. The man who does not track who owes him what, who keeps his word in the instances where no one would notice if he did not, who responds to disrespect not with escalation, but with a quiet clarity that makes the continuation of the disrespect uncomfortable for everyone present except him, who builds things slowly over years that cannot be faked, who is the same person when he has an audience and when he does not, who does not need a particular outcome from any particular interaction because his position does not depend on any particular interaction. This is not a performance of strength. It is the absence of the performance, which is itself the most powerful signal available, because it is the one signal that cannot be manufactured without already being the thing it signals.
Game theory did not discover anything that Marcus Aurelius did not already know in the 2nd century, or that Epictetus did not know before him, or that the author of the Tao Te Ching did not know millennia before that. What it did was provide the mathematics to show that these were not merely moral preferences or spiritual ideals. They were optimal strategies in the specific type of game that human social life actually is. The man who does not react is not suppressing himself. He is playing the dominant strategy. The man who keeps his word at cost is not being principled at his own expense. He is building a commitment device that compounds in value over every subsequent interaction. The man who generates rather than extracts is not being naive about human nature. He is playing non-zero sum in a world where zero-sum players consistently destroy their own position in the long run. The 1% of men that women and people genuinely respect are not special. They are not born into their position. They have simply, whether through hard experience, philosophical study, or a kind of instinctive clarity, figured out which game is actually being played, and then they stop trying to win a different one. That is available to anyone. It does not require a single impressive moment. It requires a decision made quietly to play the right game, and then a willingness to stay in it long enough for the math to work. If this shifted something in how you think about this, consider sharing it with someone who is still playing the wrong game. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of thinking, and I will see you in the next one.